Our next speaker is Brian Blumhagen.
Blumhagen.
Blumhagen. So Brian has spent the majority of his life working on swine industry, including stinting in production, genetics, nutrient management, facility maintenance, and new facility construction. He's currently director of operations for Altenburg Construction, which does sled replacements. He has a Bachelor's of Science degree and an MBA from Iowa State University and currently resides in Ames. So let's welcome our speaker.
Yeah, I got a tough commute. I got about 5 minutes to go north of town, so I am cognizant of the time, so I'll try to hurry along here and get through this really quickly to give us some time for questions. Yeah, real briefly, Altenburg Construction, we're based out of southern Minnesota, just north of Fairmont there. Been in business for over 30 years, and we have operations now here in Iowa as well. And all we do is slat replacement. My background is like in a lot of things with construction, so I'll be talking broader than just slats today. But the title of my presentation is Keeping the Facility Safe and Functional, and I'm going to do that by talking about a few different things. First off, I'm going to start with the current realities of the Midwestern infrastructure. Then we're going to talk about, when you're in your barns, what to look for, what to focus on, what's really important, what's probably not so important or can wait. And then the last part, everybody always wants to know, what's this stuff going to cost? That's been a pretty fluid thing over the last few years since COVID hit. And I've had to update these numbers, and it was kind of scary from the last time I gave a presentation like this, how much those prices have jumped. So I'll finish up with that there. To kind of set the stage, what the scale of the industry is, and I backed into this. We were kind of looking at our business and trying to decide, how do we have to prepare, what's coming at us from a growth perspective. And so all I did was I just took the December hog and pig report, and I just captured by state the number of market spaces that are in each state. And so basically this is just a list of Iowa and any of the states that touch Iowa, and then we added in Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and Kansas. So basically what this is saying, and if you use a 1,200 head equivalent barn and 8 square feet per finishing pig, you just back into these numbers. And then you kind of assume that the industry is really built up over the last 30 years. When I came in the industry in 1994 was the beginning of the building boom of confinement. And it's really, we've added all those barns over the last 30 years. And so if you look at this, in Iowa alone, we have almost 668 barns per year that are aging out, right, over the last 30 years. So across the Midwest, there's always almost 1,500, close to 1,600 barns that are getting a year older every year. And so, we built this industry over 30 years, and we had all new facilities, and now we're quickly reaching the point where we're having to do some major remodeling. And one of our options would just be tear them down and build new, right? But the reality of new construction, particularly since COVID, I'm going to make an argument today. I don't think that's probably going to happen. So these are, kind of the latest numbers using a standard double-wide tunnel vent barn. What we're looking at is about $4.25 to $4.50 a pig space for a turnkey build. Pre-COVID, that number was $325, so you can see just the impact in 5 years what that has done to new construction price. You layer in there the cost of capital, and these notes now are 8+% interest, and you're having to finance these things over 15 years. I've even heard some of them being financed over 20 years, and it's just not a real exciting thing to sign up for if you're going to invest in a barn right now. It's going to take $35 to $40 a pig space and lease just to service that facility note. And so that's the harsh reality, I think, the industry as we get these facilities aging. I'm asking the question, how many of these are going to build? And right now, based on those economics, I don't think a lot of them, okay? So that leads us into, we're going to have to take care and fix up what we have, and that starts with knowing what you got and inspecting your barns. So what to do, where do you look at? If you start with, kind of the roof, which sheds all the water, it's one of the more important parts of it. What I recommend to people is inspect them in October. Why October? Well, it's the nicest time to be in the attic, quite frankly. Pick a really bright, sunny day, and when you climb up in there, it's real obvious if you've got an issue or something to focus on. The other reason I tell you October is if you do have an issue, it's probably going to present itself in January or February when you get one of those really unique Iowa, Minnesota, heavy wet snows in December or in March, and that's going to, reveal what kind of problems you got going on in that barn. So that's what I recommend. Get up in the attic, look around. This picture here, wrong button. There we go. There we go. This is a truss plate. Some people call them gussets, but it's what's providing the strength inside that rafter system. And that's really what you're going to want to focus on first. Is there any corrosion on this plate? And if it's, how severe is that corrosion? And if it's really severe and it's really powdery and rusty when you're rubbing your hands over it, if you hit it with a hammer and it disintegrates, you got a problem. And that's what you're seeing here at this peak. Those truss plates basically disintegrated. So that's going to be one area to look at. Obviously, if you climb in your attic and you see this, you really don't have to go any further. If you've got issues and you need to call your subcontractor or contractor, which they'd love to hear from you right now, there's not a lot going on. But obviously, you're going to need a re-roof. The soffit's the other thing to look at, and the reason that's really important, particularly on the prevailing wind side, if your soffit is gone or rusted and it's on the west or the north side and you get a prevailing wind, you can fill that attic pretty quickly with snow. When you get those, 3 years ago in January when we had that basically 2-day blow, if you don't have those closed up in the prevailing wind side, you can dump a whole bunch of snow in that attic. And it all results in a failure. This was a snow failure. We loaded up the roof. We probably had weak truss plates up here, and we just dropped it down in on the pigs. And I'll talk a little bit later here what you can do to remedy that. Other things to look at, what's your insulation thickness? The more you compress insulation, you lose R value over time. Cellulose compresses, and the more it compresses, the less your R value and the less you can hold heat in that barn. Other thing you're going to look at is just screw patterns. Are you seeing a lot of missed boards and a lot of screws just going through the tin? It was probably a poor install, and it's just a source of water getting in the barn. Next one you're going to want to look at is outside your barn, and really we're just talking about perimeter stuff, curtains. The one that kind of gets overlooked a lot is just perimeter water in your observation tubes. So if you built a barn after 1998 and it's a deep pit barn, it's required by law to have a perimeter tile at the base of the barn. And if you can exit that water on site, and if you do, you don't have to have an observation tube. But if you hook on, I can talk loud. Oh, there we go. That perimeter tile is taking water pressure off that pit, right? And that really matters a couple times a year. And it really matters when you're emptying your pit, because when your pit's full, it doesn't really matter. There's not excess pressure on that. But when you suck your pit down in the fall and you get a really heavy rain and you don't get the water away from that perimeter, it's putting hydraulic pressure on that pit. If you look down here in this lower picture here, that's actually inside a barn, and that's what happens when a pit floor heaves. This was under new construction in the winter. They didn't put water in the pit, and the pit heaved, and we dropped the slats in on that pit. And so, that's what you're going to want to look at. That's what that observation tube is. Look down in there, and if it's, water halfway up in it, you got water pressure on that, and you want to keep an eye on that, particularly around pumping season. Other obvious thing, pit covers and pit fans. The biggest thing I always see is just they don't have them tight on there. If your pit fan covers aren't on there tight, the fans are just going to suck air from the least resistance. They're really not doing much for you. So keep them clean, keep them tight up against the building. If you got some gaps, fill them in with foam or caulk, but that's really important. Bulk bins are pretty much bulletproof unless they were placed in front of an exhaust fan with a poor design. We really don't see the bulk bins fail over time. So unless you're blowing exhaust air on them, they're pretty robust. Curtains, again, pretty straightforward. If there's holes in it, pressure washers are the worst thing for a curtain. If you can keep your pressure washers off of them and the rodents away from them, they'll last a long time. Make sure the pulleys are all functional. For every one of those pulleys that isn't functional, that pulley system is just working really hard to try and up and down that curtain all the time, and it just really prematurely wears it out. Inside the barn, the obvious things, your ceiling, anywhere there's your transition areas, so right along your curtains and in your inlets, those are your transition areas where you have really warm, moist air transitioning to cold air or vice versa, and that's where you get the condensation, and that's where you're going to see the deterioration first, is in those transition areas. The sill plate, number one thing is just keeping it anchored. The old barns had galvanized or non-galvanized anchor bolts. Over time, with pigs getting bigger, they're dunging in there, there's urine in there, it rusts those off, and they're a really important anchor point, particularly in derechos and tornadoes, pushing on those barns. So you're going to want to make sure that if yours are deteriorated, to get them re-anchored down there. And the best time to do that's when you're replacing your paneling on the side. Gas lines, just looking for rust and corrosion, pretty straightforward. Gating, it's amazing the differences you see. I was in some barns in the last 2 weeks, and they were the original gates. They'd lasted 28 years, but they were owner-operators, and every turn they were tightening everything down, they were welding, and they were fixing it. So if you're really good about that sort of maintenance and keeping everything tight, this stuff will last a long, long time. Inlets, fans, controllers, pretty straightforward, pretty robust. If you keep them greased and keep them in service, they last a long, long time. I'm going to get into slats a little bit more here. I'm going to spend a little bit more time, and I'm going to spend a bit more time because all those things that I talked about before, if you don't stay on top of it and something fails, it's not a big deal, right? But slats are kind of the exception. They're a lot like bankruptcy. A slat failure happens really, really slowly and then all at once. And that all at once can be kind of violent, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So the barns that were built in 1994 turned 30 years old this year, and your slats, the expected life out of a slat, and what we see typically looking at thousands and thousands of these, is 25 to 35 years. If you get 25 to 35 years out of your slats and beams, you did good. Count your blessings, but it's not the one area you're going to want to try and eke out that last year of use. And so I'll talk a little bit about what we look for in inspections and how you can maybe avoid walking into a barn or being in a barn when something like this happens. So first off, obviously, when you inspect your slats and beams, you don't go in the pit. Occasionally we have to in certain circumstances, but you can do, I would say, 99% of what we look at from above. The best way to do it's right after a turn and it's washed and dried and the lights are off with a flashlight. All this stuff stands out really, really well. If you're not comfortable, obviously, with it, there's a lot of people that do them. We obviously do them. It takes us about 1 to 2 hours to do an inspection, and we're looking at several things here. The first one is the beams. I don't know if many people understand how a pit is constructed, but you got your deep pit, you got your columns, your beams, which are these things. Oops. These things right here is what we call the beams. They sit on your columns, and then your slats are sitting on top of your beams. And the beams are the most important thing, really. It's what you don't see, right? And it's not what people easily identify, but it's the most important thing, and it's because they're carrying so much load. If you do up the math and you add up what this beam here is carrying, it's got, throughout its life, it always has 4 to probably 5 tons on it, depending on how many pigs you are and how big those pigs go. So there's always 4 to 5 tons of weight pushing down on that. And obviously it's a pretty harsh environment. It never gets cleaned like the slat surface, so all that manure and urine and everything is sitting there the whole life. So combination of a lot of heavy weight, sometimes shifts and movements, and really tough environment, chemically speaking. It's all about the beams, and that's what we're really focused on. So typically what we see, in the life of a beam, how does it start to deteriorate? And it's right up here on this column. If you've got good load, after 25, starting to approach 30 years, you'll start to see it crack right on the edge of where it sets on that beam. That's kind of the step one. And then step two is it starts to blow apart, because there's inside there, and you can see this in this beam here. You see the stick right here? That's the piece of rebar that was the reinforcement in that beam. And that's what we're trying to protect, and that's what really determines your slat and beam life is, can we keep that encased and can we keep it from corroding? The second corrosion starts when metal rusts, it expands and it starts blowing that concrete apart. And that's really, the clock is ticking there. And that's what we're trying to do. So this is really stage one. You start to see a crack. We call that, shear right there. As it gets worse and worse and worse and it gets into the rebar, it'll go across the bottom of that beam and then eventually it falls into the pit. And there's no strength there left in that beam. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking down through the slat and we're particularly looking here, and then we're looking for this long lateral crack if we see that. If we see that, we're going to be recommending a replacement sooner rather than later. Okay? The next one is the slats, a lot easier to see. Obviously on the surface, they're clean and you can do it. And again, any one of these cracks, concrete cracks, that's what it does. We look at it from how prevalent is it? Do we reach a certain threshold? And that's kind of what we would see here. If we saw an individual gang, which is these long runs here that had a crack in it, not the end of the world. When you start getting multiple ones right next to each other, it's a quantitative thing and it adds up. By the time you see the surface crack on the top here, it's already starting to have blown apart in the bottom. So the second you see a crack on the top, look at the bottom side of the slat and it's starting to come apart. Again, these are the ones that are gonna, when you get multiple ones in a row like this, they're the ones that are likely gonna fail on you. Same way with across the end rail here. If you see one crack or two cracks, not a big deal. When you start to see a series of them all occurring together, that's really the first step, and it's gonna, if you were to look at the bottom side, it's gonna start cracking down here going into that rail. And keep in mind, the slat ledge is this very corner of that slat. It's sitting on 2 inches or less, and that's where your rebar is. The second you get that rebar exposed, it starts corroding, and that's where it's carrying all the load right there. So that's where it's really important. And again, if you don't identify it and take care of it, this is the end result here. And we don't see this happen a ton, but it's just something else to be aware of and look for. Beam pockets, they're the #1 service call we get when we get calls to come out and fix. This is #1. It's something the industry's moved away from. If you built a new barn today, they just put a column here, they wouldn't have a beam pocket, but there's literally thousands and thousands and thousands of these barns out there. And so what happens over time is if this beam isn't tight to the one next to it, and it wasn't stuck in that pocket really well, over time it just works its way out, the wall shears off a little bit, the beam shears off, and it just kind of drops. If you're lucky, it just wedges in there. If you're unlucky, it drops in the pit completely, like in the picture when I started this. And you can kind of see that here. This is what it would look like in the barn. You just have a dip right next to your end walls. So you'll see this on your end walls, and you'll see it in your center walls. That's where you'll typically see that. Pretty simple process for us to fix, but it's a key area to look at because it's the #1 service call we get is beam pockets. And then the last thing we're looking for is what are the bearing surfaces? This has nothing to do with the quality of the slat manufacturer or beam manufacturer. This was a poor installation. You can see this column here. We want the same amount of this beam on that column as this beam, and it's about a 3/4 versus 1/4. So there's not enough surface area. So what's going to happen is that it's going to crack here. The top of this column is going to crack, and it's just going to shear off and drop that in there. So those are the things that we're looking at when we're doing an inspection, and it's mostly under the slat, the stuff that's not obvious to you. But again, really, really important. All right, I'm going to wrap up here talking about understanding some of the costs. I want to give Zach Brea at New Modern Concepts credit. He shared with me jobs he's currently quoting. They're a general contractor up in Iowa Falls, and these are as current as I could get in terms of what these costs are. if you talk about re-roofing a 2400, and I've put this all in terms of, pig space and then total cost, but it's all based on a 2400 head barn. If you were to re-roof a 2400 with 29 gauge G100, so the gauge is just the thickness, that's a pretty good quality, I would say now. It'd be a 29 gauge, and then the G rating is just your galvanization. It's the amount of zinc that's in there, and it's the more corrosion resistant. So again, that would be a really good high quality re-roof there. But you're looking at roughly $20 a pig space to do a fairly straightforward 2400 head barn, or about $48,000. So keep in mind, the new construction that I talked about when I started was about $1 million, a little over $1 million on these barns. So you can kind of keep track of what each level of repair is going to cost and what's your total when you get to the end if you have to do all this stuff. We talked about truss plates. If you had the best time to fix your truss plates or your gussets is when you're doing a re-roof. And so if most truss manufacturers, if you go back to whoever made your trusses, they will actually have a patch, and they will tell you, put this thickness of wood, this pattern, this screw pattern, and there's actually an engineered fix for that. It's pretty straightforward when the roof's off, but you're looking at about $10,000 to do a minor fix-up. If you had to do every gusset plate, you're probably getting closer to $50,000 sort of dollars. But no, we go over top. Mm-hmm. Moving inside the barn, this is the big one. Obviously, the slat and beam replacement is going to be the most expensive thing you'd have to do probably in a finisher barn. If you have to do a full replacement, and we as a company would never recommend not doing slats and beams together. Some people look at their beams and they're just like, I think they'll be fine. And we're like, no, it's going to be the worst decision. You're going to hate it in 5 years when you have to come back and do that. So this would be an all-in cost, slats, beams, labor. For a 2400, you're looking at about $160,000 or about $65 to $75 a pig space. What really makes that variable is how far away are you from your slat manufacturer, because it's all about weight, right? It's a lot of heavy weight that we have to truck in and out. So that's kind of the range you would expect. You can kind of see it here. I also touched on a slat shield product. You can see it. This was in one we did. We put down a protective coating around the feeders there. Wet dry, I didn't really touch on it when I was talking about the slats, but wet dry feeders are really bad for slats. Feed in general is kind of hard on slats, but wet dry feeders. So if you've got a barn with wet dry feeders and you're not doing anything to protect those slats and you're not staying on top of the patching, you can expect to have to replace the slats around the feeder before the rest of the barn is going to need it. So we do sell a product that does protect that. Comes with an 8-year warranty, and it costs about $450 a pig space or $300 a feeder. Ceilings, this is for a full ceiling replacement. There's a lot of stuff you can do, patch pieces in over time, but once you get to the point where, 30 or 40% of that ceiling starts having, some sort of holes in it, you're probably looking at it's time to replace the whole ceiling. And you got a couple different options here. If you've got steel in there, you're going to have, and you want to use aluminum, you're going to have to take the steel down and put it back up, which means you're going to have to re-insulate. So you're looking at about $25 a pig space or $60,000 for a 2400. If you want to keep your existing steel, you can go up with plastic over the top of that, and it is a little bit cheaper. You're looking at about $17 a pig space to do a ceiling in a barn. You get into gating, it would be the second most expensive item after, the slats and beams to be replaced in a barn. I see all over the board, I see gates that are having to be replaced that weren't taken care of or maybe not the best quality at 12 years. And like I said last week, I saw one that was 24 years old, and it was the original gating, but really well built when it was put in there, and it was really well taken care of. But that's what you're looking at on the gating side. From a feeder perspective, you got obviously the wet-dry type is going to be more expensive, or the dry type, but anywhere from $11 to $18 a pig space probably to switch out those feeders. Curtain replacement, last time I checked, it was running about $18, $19 a linear foot installed. So on a 2400, another $6 a pig space. And then the last one is if you just, were burning a lot of propane, or your insulation was really compressed, or it had blown around over the years in the attic and it wasn't evenly spaced. If you're gonna reblow the insulation in there, get that back to like an R30, you're probably looking at something like $6.50 a pig space. So again, back to the point is, we can do a lot of stuff in these barns if it's sited well. You can take advantage of the driveway, the well. You don't have to frustrate all the neighbors by building a new pig barn next to them. I think the math is going to say we're going to put a lot of money into fixing these barns up, and we'll economically be money ahead. Not to say we won't build some new barns for certain reasons, whether it's located and it's a gilt grow out or something specific like that. But right now the math is going to suggest that as we go through these barns that are aging out every year, we're going to fix them up, I think. So with that, thanks for having me. I'll entertain any questions anybody has. Yeah.
Is there any disadvantage over going over the plastic or the aluminum ceilings or the old ones?
You just don't have to re-insulate. I mean, that's the big one. In my experience, it washes the same. So from a cleanup standpoint, unless you get some crazy power washer that puts a zero tip right up on it, it'll stand up to, I think, anything that the plastic or the aluminum would. Mm-hmm.
What about ripple?
Well, you will pay more for an installer to put plastic up because they have to screw it more frequently. But that was built into the cost that I put on there. It's a higher installation cost because they do have to screw it more.
New builds, if you were building a new one, you put plastic?
I'd put aluminum. Yeah, white smooth aluminum. Mm-hmm.
But it'll deteriorate too.
Yeah, I haven't seen it as much in finishers. I've seen it in these filtered sow farms doing it for some reason I can't explain, and I don't know that anybody else has given me a good reason why yet. But I haven't seen it do that in a finisher.
But when they took out the two feeders and put in the wet dries, they didn't replace the slap savers?
That's not the right term. They're not slat savers, they're feed savers.
That's what they're called, okay.
Yeah, but they don't, all they do is move the slat problem over to the edge.
Yeah, I understand that.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard two reasons. That one and the other one was you can't get them clean around the edge very well, so from a biosecurity standpoint.
Sure, I could see that. Yeah, there's manure build up there, but yeah, I call them feed savers, they are not a slat saver.
If you have deterioration outside of that area there,
Yeah.
you're not showing a re-rot or anything like that, what does it cost to go in and do a barn, a whole 2,400?
Yeah, so when we apply our actual slat protectant, the price variation is based on, is it a new slat or is it an old slat? And just what that comes down to is, do we have to build that slat back up? If it's got deep erosion and the pebbles are showing, before we would apply that protectant, we would put a concrete, for example, on there, and we would bring that back up smooth. And so it's a two-step process in that case for us, but you're looking at $13.50 a square foot applied to build it up and apply the shield.
You wouldn't do it over the whole?
We recommend 3 gangs out from your feeder and 12 inches on the end. So that seems to be about where the erosion stops, is the first 3 gangs are 12 inches on the end. So.
Do you know how much they're paying for a barn? The integrators paying?
The last ones I heard were in the low 40s, but that was, right at the end of COVID, and yeah, so I don't know of anybody offering contracts right now on new barns, but I haven't heard. Last ones I knew were low 40s.
You other questions?
All right.
Let's thank our
Thank you.